Well, brethren, it's nice to be with you this morning. It's not often we get to say morning here in Portsmouth, but this year is certainly moving by very quickly. Here we are in June already, almost halfway through June. Seems like we just completed the days of unleavened bread, and tomorrow's Pentecost. We live in a very fast-paced world. Everything is go, go, go. As we go about our lives, it's easy to become overwhelmed. Then we start to get bogged down, and if we're not careful, we can become very weary in doing well. Paul warns us about this, not to allow ourselves to fall into this category. We can't lose sight of our goal, brethren. We have to maintain the goal that we're moving towards. Let's go to Galatians 6 and verses 7 through 9. Galatians chapter 6, and we'll start in verse 7 and read through 9. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows with his flesh will reap of the flesh corruption. But he who sows of the Spirit shall reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. And that's the key. Paul encourages us here to focus on the spiritual and not the physical aspect of our lives. At the same time, encouraging us not to grow weary in doing well. We, brethren, are not to lose sight of our spiritual purpose. God is working out in each of our lives. God has begun a purpose in our life that we must not lose sight of. That's one of the blessings of keeping the holy days. It helps us to recalibrate our spiritual compass. Let's look at an example of someone who stayed focused on the task that God gave him to do. Please turn with me back to the book of Nehemiah. We'll read Nehemiah chapter 6. Breaking into the story here, Nehemiah had been tasked with rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. And there were those who did not want that to happen. So if we pick this story up in chapter 6, verse 1 through 3. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tabitha, and Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors on the gates. They came, saying, Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messages to them, saying, I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave and go down to you? You see, if you think about this, they were trying to distract Nehemiah from the task that God had given him to do. This is one of the tools that Satan uses in our lives. He tries to distract us. He tries to get us to lose focus on the job that God has for each of us to do. Just like with Nehemiah, if he can get our focus off of our calling, it sets up the opportunity for him to take us out. And as Nehemiah pointed out, if he left, the work would cease. You know, if we go off in a different direction, our work ceases. So we have to stay focused on our calling. And that's what Nehemiah did. He stayed focused on the job that God had given him to do. Let's pick it back up in verse 4. But they sent this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. So they were very persistent. They tried 4 different times to get him to leave his post. Just like Satan is with us, he's always trying to keep us from our goal of qualifying for God's kingdom. You know, and sometimes he throws the same thing at us over and over again. But we have to stay focused, and we cannot lose heart. Let's go to 1 Peter 5. We want to mark Nehemiah because we will be coming back to that. First Peter 5, and let's read verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. You know, when you think about the characteristic of a lion, they don't just kind of meander around and say, oh, well, I think I'll take this one. They look for the weak spots. They look for people who are not on their guard, who are not on their game. And brethren, we can't fall into that category. Let's go back to Nehemiah. Pick the story back up in chapter 6 and verse 5 through 8. Then they sent messages by the servant as before, the 5th time, this time with an open letter in hand. And it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judea. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, and let us consult together. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. You see, we see a change of tactic here. Their attitude was, if we can't stop him one way, we'll try a different approach. How many times in our Christian lives have we seen this very thing play out in our lives? Time and time again, we are faced with a trial. We ask God for help, and God does help us. Then we face something from a different angle. So we see a change of tactic. But see, the goal's the same. It's to make us lose focus and to get distracted. Let's go back to 1 Peter 5:8 on what that says. Our adversary walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So the first tactic that they used against him was they tried to get him distracted. Well, that didn't work. So then they tried to put fear into him. Let's go back to Nehemiah chapter 6 and pick the story up in verse 9. For they were trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in their work, and it will not be done. Just as they were trying to make Nehemiah afraid, to get him to stop the work that God had given him to do, Satan does that with each and every one of us. But we need not be afraid, for we can take confidence in God as our protector. Let's go to Psalms chapter 23 and read verse 4. Psalms chapter 23 and verse 4. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted, and you delivered them. See, if we trust in God, no matter what we're facing, God will be there with us to help us. But we have to keep our focus on our goal and not let Satan throw us off track. You know, brethren, we face many trials in our lifetime, but we're not facing those alone. We have that help that we need to get through whatever trial it is that we're facing. Let's go to Psalms chapter 34 read verse 4. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from my fears. See, having a close relationship with our Father takes away the fear out of our lives. Just as Nehemiah did, we have to stay focused on our goal by placing trust in our Father. We have nothing to fear. You know, back a few years ago, actually it's been several years ago, I used to haul straw to the strip mines in eastern Kentucky. And on this one particular trip I went down there, they said, "Oh, pull off the road here a little bit, over into this ground over here where it's softer, so we can unload over there so that we won't have to unload here in the road." I said, "I'm not so sure about that." He goes, "Oh, it'll be all right." I pulled off over there. As soon as I pulled off, snapped the axle in my truck. So I'm like, great. Well, it was close to Prestonsburg, but Pikeville was the closest Ford dealership. So I got a ride down to the Ford dealership, and I said, "Hey, here's the part I need." And he goes, "Just one problem, I don't have it. It's in Huntington." I said, "Oh." So I rented a truck and drove to Huntington, come back. The guy that owned the dealership met me there and took me back to the mine. Just one problem. All the guys had gone home for the day, and there was a cable across the road. I'm like, ugh. And my truck was about, I'm guessing, 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles back up in those hills. Well, we finally got a hold of the folks, and so I said, "Well, it's getting dark." I said, "I'm going to head back up towards the truck." So I, with the axle in tow, headed back up over the hill, went down the valley. There's only one problem. It's only sunshine in that valley about for an hour a day. Not really, but it was pretty deep into the hills. But the point is, it was getting dark. And you're in an area, you're unfamiliar with it, you don't really know what's going on, what kind of wildlife there may be in the area. I'd heard of bears and mountain lions and everything else, and of course every little noise you hear. So, time to start praying. Well, I made it to the truck, got the axle unbolted, got ready to put the new axle in. Just one problem. Where it had broke off, about 3 inches of that axle was still inside the differential. Oh no. Back to the prayer again. Dug around in the truck and found a coat hanger, stuck it in there, and just so happened in the last 3 inches of that axle, there was a bearing that went on that, and it had a hole in the center of the axle. Now this thing's about 3 foot long, with a coat hanger that I straightened out by hand. So it wasn't very straight. But by a miracle from above, I was able to stick that coat hanger in there and slide that piece of axle out in about 2 minutes flat. I was like, thank you. So put everything back together, drove back to the entrance of the mine, and they come down and let me out. But you know what? It's amazing what your imagination will play tricks with you on when you're faced in that situation, because you don't really know what's going on. It's very unfamiliar. But you know what? God's with you every step of the way. Let's go back to our story in Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 10. We'll go through 14 this time. Afterwards, I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Dalani, the son of Metabiah, I probably just butchered those names, but who was a secret informer, and he said, "Hey, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let's close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you. You indeed at night, they will come and they will kill you." And I said, "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go." Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he had pronounced this prophecy against me because of the others who were trying to take his life. For this reason he was hired, and I sought that I should be afraid and not act, that that might have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. You see, perception is something that God gives his people. This story became very clear to me. A few years ago, I had a privilege of going to Scotland for the feast. And while I was there, I was able to meet an English-speaking minister by the name of David House. And he was telling me about a trip that he had taken to Africa. And he was actually to the country of Niger. And as he was taking that trip and he got off the plane, someone met him as soon as they got off the plane and said, "Mr. House, you're to come with me." And he said, "I just had this really bad feeling like, I don't think so." And he said, "I kept on going." He said, "I met another guy." He said, "Mr. House, you're to come with me." He said, "Yeah, this one's okay." But see, it's that power of God's Spirit that gave him that perception to see what was going on. And I asked him the question, I said, "Well, Mr. House, what would have happened if you'd have went with the first guy?" He said, "You and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now." So God's Spirit in us and the power of God that's working through us gives us an extra edge, brethren, that most people don't have. You see, this was just another way of trying to make Nehemiah afraid of doing the task that God had sent him to do. Satan uses others to get us distracted from that purpose that God has for us. We can't take our focus off of that spiritual purpose, brethren, that God has for each of us. We have to finish the job that we've been given to do. We have to keep our eyes on the prize and don't be afraid. Remember the parable of the talents? What happened to the one servant? "Oh, I was afraid. I hid your talent in the ground. Here it is back again." That's not what God wants. God does not want us to have a spirit of fear. But there is a type of fear that God does want us to have. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 9 and look at verse 10. Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So having a fear of God is the right type of fear that we should have. See, the right fear of God leads to life. He is our protector, and he's the one that we can have confidence in. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 19 and read verse 23. Proverbs 19, verse 23. "The fear of the Lord leads to life, and he who has it will abide in satisfaction. He will not be visited with evil." You see, there is a proper fear that we should have, and that is fearing God in a way, and it's not so much of like, "Oh, he's going to strike me down." It's a matter of having respect for his word and respect for what he's teaching us to do. That's the proper fear that we should have. Let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all." As Solomon points out, the proper fear of God is a good thing. It's not something that is a bad thing. It's actually the proper respect for God is what we should have. Because he's doing all of this for us, brethren. He's helping us in every aspect of our lives. And he will do that because that's what he said he'd do. Let's go back to Nehemiah and see how Nehemiah's work finished up. Pick the story back up in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15 and 16. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul, and in 52 days. And it happened, when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around saw these things, they were very disheartened in their own eyes. For they perceived, see, that perception goes both ways. For they perceived that this work was done by our God. You see, by staying focused on the task that God had given him, Nehemiah was able to do his job. And that's the main point, brethren, for each and every one of us. We have to keep our hands to the plow. We have to build our spiritual house that God has given us. We can't allow ourselves to become distracted. We don't need to be fearful except the proper fear of God. You see, Satan does not in any way want us to complete what God has given us to do. But just like Paul pointed out, we're in a race. We're in a spiritual race. And that race requires that we take the effort to put one foot in front of the other, that we keep moving forward. We don't stop. We don't get distracted. Yeah, sometimes we stumble, sometimes we fall. And God's right there to pick us back up again. No matter what trial we're facing, no matter what circumstances that we have in our lives, we're not alone. He's there for us. He knows, Satan knows, that when we do it, it will be because the work was done by the power of our Father. And that's really what the whole purpose is. God's working out a purpose in our lives. He wants us to overcome ourselves. He wants us to keep moving forward, to keep going, not stop, don't get distracted, and don't get discouraged. Brethren, it's time to break out the mortar. Let's build the wall that God has called us to build in our spiritual lives. And sometimes that requires keeping that wall repaired. Sometimes the things that we go through may knock a piece of mortar or brick off here and there. You have to break it out, put the new mortar back in, and stick it back in there. Keep right on the motor. Let's don't be distracted. Let's don't be fearful. Let's keep our focus on God's purpose in our lives. And if we do that, brethren, what did Mr. Armstrong tell us? We win. In the long run, we win.